I'm John Allen, the editor of Crux, an independent online Catholic news agency. You can find us online at cruxnow.com. That is cruxnow.com. I am also a fellow, a proud fellow at the Word on Fire Institute. Welcome to another episode of The John Allen Show, brought to you by the good people at Word on Fire. This week, as we do every week here on the show, I am going to give you the story and then the rest of the story. So the story is this. We have just wrapped up the tumultuous October 6th to the 27th Synod of Bishops on the Amazon. This was 2 years in the making. It was a high-octane, high-drama, high-controversy affair, arguably the most controverted and discussed assembly of bishops in Rome since the Second Vatican Council in the mid-1960s. Now, I'm going to unpack the significance of this for you, but before I do, two quick caveats that you need to bear in mind. Number one, a Synod of Bishops is not the United States Congress. It is not the Parliament of the United Kingdom. It is not the General Assembly of the United Nations. It has no decision-making power of its own. Its lone function is to make recommendations to the Pope, in this case, Pope Francis. Secondly, it is also important to remember that this was a regional Synod of Bishops. That is, it brought together the bishops from the Amazon rainforest itself, from the 9 countries that share some portion of the Amazon, and of course 60% of the Amazon rainforest is in Brazil, so this assembly was kind of top-heavy with Brazilians. So it is not necessarily representative of the global church. Now, with those two caveats in mind, Pope Francis invested a great deal of personal energy in this assembly. He called it a full 2 years ago, in October 2017. And honestly, and I will tell you the complete truth, when that happened, when the announcement was made 2 years ago, many of us thought, this might be of limited regional interest in the Amazon, but we were kind of scratching our heads as to how to turn this into a story for the world, for the global church. And boy, were we wrong. Because this turned out to be an incredibly fascinating, riveting, controversial exercise, and the echoes of which I think will be with us for quite some time. At a soundbite level, I am tempted to say that this was the Synod of the 3 Ps. Those 3 Ps would be the Peripheries, the Priesthood, and the Pachamama. And if you don't know what that is, I will come to that in a little bit. But probably the more substantive analytical way to describe this Synod is in terms of that classic Catholic distinction between the church ad extra, that is, its engagement with the outside world, and the church ad intra, that is, meaning its own internal life, doctrine, discipline, practice, and so on. At the ad intra level, this synod was motivated, and this is what Pope Francis said from the very beginning, by the desire to call the church and the wider world to the defense of the peoples of the Amazon, particularly the roughly 400 indigenous communities who live in its territory, and the rainforest itself. Now, that is what motivated Francis 2 years ago, and it might have seemed a bit obscure or esoteric then. But of course, over the summer in the run-up to this synod, we saw the fires, the roughly 80,000 different wildcat fires that tore into the Amazon and galvanized the conscience of the world. All of a sudden, that aspect of this synod's agenda became incredibly relevant. At that level, what this synod produced was a kind of cri de coeur, beginning within the Catholic Church and then radiating out to the wider world, to show greater respect to the persons of the Amazon and to the ecology of the Amazon. Examples of the kinds of ideas it generated. One is the call for the world to establish a global solidarity fund that would help the indigenous persons of the Amazon protect themselves against exploitation, presumably through litigation and political advocacy. It would also provide compensation when damage occurs. Another would be the invitation to the Catholic Church to develop a set of what are known as ecological sins. That is, in addition to the traditional catalog of sins that the Church already recognizes, there would be a new index of sins against what the Synod defined as sins against God, one's neighbor, one's community, and the environment itself. Now, exactly what that will mean in practice is yet to be determined, but it certainly is a symbol of the Synod's earnestness in tackling these twin threats against the people and the environment of the Amazon. Now, in many ways, the drama, however, was not on the ad extra level. It was on the ad intra level. There were three particular issues there. One, the idea of expanding use of married priests as a solution to the chronic priest shortages that plague the Amazon. There are some isolated rural communities in the Amazon that may be lucky to see a priest once a year. And that was much talked about, much debated. In the end, the Synod offered essentially a thumbs up, a recommendation to the Pope that he take that step. Another was the issue of women deacons, the backdrop to which was a kind of universal desire in the Synod to recognize the critically important role that women, and I think, in fairness, in particularly women religious, play in the Amazon. And they cast about for ways in which to bolster and ennoble and affirm that role. The idea of female deacons, in part because it has already been on the agenda. Pope Francis established a commission to study that idea in 2016. The Synod turned to that idea. It didn't exactly issue a straight endorsement. What it ended with was a request that as that consideration of women deacons unfolds, that the voice of the Amazon be heard as part of the conversation. Finally, there was the issue of trying to recognize the role, the importance, and the dignity of indigenous cultures and their modes of religious and spiritual expression within the Catholic liturgy. Some suggested the creation of a special Amazon rite of the Catholic Mass. Others suggested that the existing Latin rite of the Mass could be adapted. The Synod ended with a recommendation for greater study on that issue. And then finally, there was the symbolic role of the Pachamama. Now, just in case you weren't paying attention, the Pachamama, well, I mean, if you look it up on Google or in the Encyclopedia Britannica, what it will tell you is that the Pachamama is an Incan fertility figure that is venerated in the Andes and in portions of the Amazon. But what it refers to in this context is that there were small figures, indigenous figures, of a naked pregnant woman that first showed up at a prayer ceremony in the Vatican Gardens before the Synod opened, then were featured in the Synod's opening procession. Finally, they were put on display in a Roman church. Debate erupted immediately about what exactly these things depicted. Some insisted they were pagan idols. Others initially wanted to argue that they were indigenous depictions of the Virgin Mary, and in particular, the visitation, Mary's visit to her cousin Elizabeth when both were pregnant. Vatican spokespersons insisted these were simply indigenous figures representing life, and they had no particular religious significance. But in any event, they became the defining symbol of this Synod. And that was capped off, of course, when some traditionalist critics of the Synod went into that Roman church early in the morning on Monday, October 21st, grabbed those figurines, took them out of the church, took them to the nearby Tiber River, and tossed them into the river in a kind of gesture of disgust. They were then fished out of the river by the Italian military police and restored to the Vatican. And in many ways, they became, in miniature, a symbol of the broader controversies and debates that surrounded the entire exercise. So, at the end of the day, this was an assembly of bishops that both ad extra and ad intra engaged in some tremendously relevant, consequential and dramatic debates. They have now made recommendations to the Pope, and the drama pivots to what Pope Francis is going to do with what he has heard. That's the story. Please stick around for the rest of the story.
Hey everybody, it's Jared Zimmer, the director of Bishop Robert Barron's Word on Fire Institute. I hope you're enjoying the John Allen Show, which is yet another production brought to you by the Word on Fire Institute. I wanted to take a few seconds just to invite you to become a member of the Institute, where we offer numerous different aspects that can help form you as an evangelist. Things like courses on theology and philosophy and psychology and sociology. You'll also receive a quarterly journal in the mail throughout the year. Another exclusive offer that we'll be having if you enjoy the John Allen Show is a live Q&A with John, where you can ask questions about the culture, the church, media, etc. So when you join, you also get free access to Word on Fire Digital, which houses all of Bishop Barron's feature films, topical studies, study materials, and the like. So visit wordonfire.institute and come help us proclaim Christ to the culture.
So the rest of the story is this. Let's go back to the distinction between the Synod ad extra and ad intra. As I mentioned at the top of the show, ad extra, this was a synod devoted to the peoples, the indigenous communities of the Amazon, and also the defense of the environment in the Amazon, particularly against what is seen as a kind of, what Pope Francis has sometimes termed savage capitalism, a kind of model of development, a sort of slash and burn model of development that is predicated on exploitation rather than sustainable development. Probably the two most cited words over and over and over again in this synod, and they also feature prominently in the concluding document of the synod, would be this phrase that comes from Pope Francis, which is integral ecology. The idea being that you can't solve the problems of the environment in isolation from equal attention to issues such as poverty, war and peace, and the arms trade and armed conflict, and the fate of marginalized and forgotten peoples. That you either address these things as a package deal or you fail to resolve them individually. And the Synod tried to encapsulate, I think, endorse, and accelerate Catholic commitment to that idea. As I mentioned, two of the specific concepts that emerged from the Synod, one is the idea of a global solidarity fund for indigenous persons. Now, of course, that's not something the Catholic Church can pick up the tab for. Action on that will depend upon whether governments at the local, national, and international level decide to commit resources to it. The other was the emergence of this idea of naming ecological sins. You know, in the Middle Ages, theologians developed these things called manuals for confessors. They were very detailed catalogs, taxonomies, if you like, of various kinds of sin with evaluations of their relative gravity or seriousness. And this was intended to help confessors, when they were in the confessional with penitents, decide how serious the things they were confessing were and the types of penance that would be appropriate for these sins. You know, it may be that in the aftermath of this synod, we're going to need a kind of 21st century newfangled manual for confessors that will also catalog these new ecological sins and will assess their relative gravity and give priests some guidance about the kinds of penances that would be appropriate. But in any event, it is both a symbolic and substantive way for the Church to get across how serious it is in terms of the issues that this synod were intended to throw into relief. And of course, against the backdrop of the dramatic fires in the Amazon that raged over the summer, all that seems suddenly incredibly timely, incredibly relevant. Now, you know, the problem, of course, is that saving the peoples of the Amazon, saving the rainforest itself, that is not entirely up to the Church, and it certainly is not entirely up to Pope Francis. It will depend upon the extent to which the church is able to mobilize its resources to arouse the conscience of the wider world. And that's a drama that certainly was not resolved with the closing mass of the Synod on last Sunday. It's something we're going to have to gauge in the days, weeks, months, and years to come. On the ad intra level, again, the three main ideas here were the idea of the ordination of married, or an expansion, really, in the ordination of married priests, because, of course, there already are married priests in the Catholic Church. You could think of the 23 Eastern Rite churches in communion with Rome, all of whom have a married priesthood. Or, in the United States, the hundreds of former Episcopalians, Lutherans, Methodists, who have converted to the Catholic Church as married ministers, who have been ordained as priests and allowed to remain married. So this is not a break with previous custom, it's an expansion in previous custom is what is being proposed. Two interesting things about this. One, there were other ways to get at the priest shortage that were talked about during the course of the Synod. Some bishops floated the idea of reviving the medieval custom of the sacerdos simplex, a simple priest, that is a man who was ordained exclusively to celebrate Mass, and really nothing else. I mean, that is, he wouldn't on a routine basis, unless there were dire threats, be hearing confessions, he wouldn't be doing baptisms, the other things that priests do. And his only other obligation would be to pray the office, the official daily prayer of the church. That happened a lot in the Middle Ages, but it sort of died out. Some were proposing reviving that. That didn't really take off. Another idea that came from, among others, Cardinal Christoph Schönborn of Vienna in Austria, who was one of the papally appointed participants in this synod, was that we really don't need to expand, we don't need married priests, we just need to expand the permanent diaconate. The problem with that is, it doesn't address the question of access to the Eucharist, because of course deacons can't celebrate the Eucharist. So in the end, the Synod fell back on the idea of the viri probati, that is, tested married men, although they circumscribed it a little bit more by saying that these are tested married men who should already be deacons. But in any event, it is a prescription for an expansion of married priests in the Catholic Church. It would be very interesting to see what Pope Francis does with that. One option would be for him to say, okay, I'm going to take this under advisement, but not really move forward in any near-term future. Another would be for him to say, okay, I've heard you, I think it's a great idea, let's go for it, and he would give a kind of limited permission for regionally circumscribed experimentation in the Amazon. Now, some believe that if he were to do that, it would end up it would be sort of a Trojan horse that would lead to, essentially, the eradication of mandatory celibacy in the entire Latin Rite Church. One way around that would be for the Vatican to put some numerical limitations on it. They could say, the idea here is for the use of married priests to serve isolated rural communities that presently do not have access to the Eucharist. So they could say that this permission only applies in dioceses where the priest-to-person ratio is a certain number. I mean, to give you an example, in the United States in general, the priest-to-person ratio is 1 to 1,300. That is, there is one Catholic priest for every 1,300 baptized Catholics. In some parts of the Amazon, that ratio can be as high as 1 to 15,000, 1 to 18,000. So they could establish a cutoff point saying your priest-to-person ratio has to be here. Or another way to do it would be to say you can only have so many priests per square mile in the territory for which you are responsible before this ad experimentum permission to ordain married men would apply. And there are, of course, many other possibilities as well. So it's going to be fascinating to track how that develops. On the issue of women deacons, again, the Synod here did not give a straight thumbs up. What it said was that it wants the study of this question to continue, and it wants the voices of the Amazon to be heard. Now, trying to forecast what Pope Francis is going to do with that, if anything, it's even more difficult than with the married priest question, because this is really the first time the married priest question has been dropped squarely on the Pope's plate. Women deacons, however, have been around since 2016, when Pope Francis went to a meeting of the umbrella group for women religious in Rome. And a sister, ironically, a sister from Brazil, asked the Pope to consider ordaining women deacons. He said he would do so. He created a study commission. That commission took about a year, and then it presented a report to the Pope that did not deliver a straightforward yes or no, but simply reported on the various opinions that had surfaced during the course of their consideration. And that report has been sitting on the Pope's desk for 2 years, and he hasn't acted on it. Now, some would say that means the Pope doesn't want to do this. Others would say it means the Pope was waiting for some other occasion to act. I honestly don't know how to forecast what Francis is going to do on this. Probably the most likely thing is that he will reactivate either the commission that already existed, or will create some new panel and invite them to take into consideration the input of voices from the Amazon region. But what that probably means is that it's not going to be that the Synod wrapped on Sunday, and so by the middle of next week, we're going to have women deacons. Probably the arc of time is a little bit longer than that. Finally, on the idea of an Amazon rite of the Mass, this is not as novel as it may sound. After the Second Vatican Council in 1969, the bishops of what was then Zaire, it is now the Democratic Republic of the Congo, petitioned the Vatican to create an African rite of the Mass that would incorporate African spirituality, African customs. They got a green light to begin working on that. Finally, in the 1980s, a new African rite, which is now known as the Zaire rite, was promulgated by the Vatican. So if they were to green light a similar kind of exercise for the Amazon, it certainly would not be a bolt from the blue. On the other hand, there were others at the Synod who felt that you didn't really need to create an entirely new rite. You could take the existing Latin rite and simply give a kind of more limited permission to blend in some expression, some indigenous customs, language, rituals, and so on, and situate that within the context of the Catholic liturgy to make it clear that those things were being invested with a kind of Christian significance. What the Synod recommended is study. My own read would be it is very likely that Pope Francis will authorize a study. What that may lead to in the long run, well, we will see. Time will tell. And then finally, let us come to the question of the Pachamama. I tried to explain this earlier in the show, but again, this is whether or not these figures were actually the Pachamama, by the way, remains a debated point. But that is the kind of shorthand way in Italy that all of us have come to refer to these statuettes, these figurines of a naked pregnant woman, carved. These are wooden figurines, carved in a kind of indigenous style, that were prepared in anticipation of the Synod by an outfit called REPAM, that is the ecclesial network for the Amazon. And they asked an artisan from the Amazon to prepare these images. And of course, they were prominently displayed during a prayer service in the Vatican Gardens on October 4th. That's the Feast of St. Francis, and 2 days before the Synod opened, involving the indigenous persons who participated in the Synod along with Pope Francis. They were displayed during the opening procession, which initiated in St. Peter's Basilica and then wound its way towards the Synod Hall. They were borne aloft in a canoe by participants in the Synod. They were then displayed in the Church of Santa Maria of Traspontina, which is a church here in Rome that is located about halfway down the Via della Conciliazione. That is the broad avenue that leads from St. Peter's Square to Castel San Angelo, the historical papal fortress at the end of the street, right by the Tiber River. These things, improbably, in many ways, they became the star of the show. I mean, almost arguably more than the Pope himself, more than anyone else who took part in this synod. The figure of the Pachamama was the thing that was at the forefront of people's minds, and it was on the top of everyone's tongues. There were a variety of different reactions to these images. At one sort of far end of opinion, these things were styled as pagan gods, pagan idols, and their presence in Catholic sacred space was therefore not only deeply offensive, but sort of tantamount to heresy. That, of course, is what motivated the people who broke into the Church of Traspontina to throw them into the Tiber River. One of them, by the way, and we know this because he owned up to his role in this theft on his own private YouTube channel, is an Italian who is actually fairly notorious. He is not a Catholic cleric, but he goes under the pseudonym of Padre Davide, or Father David. He usually dresses in clerical attire. And he is somebody who earlier in his life, at one point had claimed to be, apparently falsely, had claimed to be a relative of Benito Mussolini, the infamous fascist dictator of Italy. And who was also indicted and convicted at one point under Italian hate speech laws. And he claimed he was acting by stealing the Pachamama. He claimed he was acting to defend the church from Satanism. As I say, that's kind of the far end of the spectrum. I think closer to the middle, other people who were troubled by this symbolism would say that it seemed to them a kind of uncritical embrace of all things indigenous, of every aspect of indigenous cultures and religiosity. And yet, the exchange between Christianity and culture is not supposed to be a one-way street. It's supposed to be a dialogue. Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI talks about Christianity's role in purifying culture. And I think the question of these critics would be, where was the purification in all of this? Where was the kind of critical edge, the invitation to these cultures to go deeper into the Christian view of the world and the Christian sense of what it means to be a believer? And that's a reasonable concern. Others would suggest that, this is about meeting people where they are. It's about showing respect for indigenous cultures and spirituality, and this is the beginning of a conversation, not the end. That is, it is the opening act of evangelization, not the conclusion, and that it was entirely appropriate. As I mentioned at the top of the show, some initially tried to argue that this was actually a depiction of the Virgin Mary. That kind of collapsed under its own weight when the Vatican itself disowned that hypothesis. Although there is now a kind of rearguard attempt to suggest that, it may not have been an image of the Virgin in the beginning, but perhaps we can invest it with that significance now. The thing of it is, some people will tell you that the ferment around the Pachamama was just a sideshow. It was a distraction. It's street theater that has nothing to do with the substance of this synod. I'm not sure I buy that. The thing of it is, what did the Pachamama symbolically come to represent? Well, in many ways, it represented some of the core aspects of this papacy, didn't it? It came to be a symbolic expression of Francis's passion for the peripheries, his embrace and dialogic approach to non-Christian cultures and faiths, his bottom-up ecclesiology, his third world social and political agenda. I think it would be a fool's errand to try to argue that those are not central defining aspects of this papacy. So, as silly in some ways as the debate over the Pachamama became, nevertheless, I think there was a kind of legitimate gut instinct there that it symbolizes something important. And further, symbols often, we say a picture is worth 1,000 words. Symbol, I think, are worth 1,000 pictures. This symbol, I think, is going to be the thing that lasts in the collective memory about this synod. 50 or 100 years from now, when we forget a lot of the specific verbiage, the recommendations, and all of that this synod produced, I think the Pachamama Synod is nevertheless going to continue to be something that we remember. And that, in a nutshell, is what made this such a remarkable experience. It didn't just deliver substance that matters, ad extra and ad intra. It also delivered memorable, defining symbolism that will make sure that this event is carried forward in our collective memory. And, whatever we think of it, I think that is the dictionary definition of an assembly of bishops that mattered. So you can find all of this broken down on the Crux site. Once again, that is www.cruxnow.com. Cruxnow.com, your one-stop shopping destination for the very best in smart, wired, and independent Catholic journalism. I would also encourage you to be visiting the Word on Fire site, where you can find Bishop Robert Barron's homilies and his commentary on all kinds of things, including the Amazon Synod. It's got a truckload of valuable resources that you should be checking in on. And I would encourage you to spend the next 2 weeks between now and the next time we see one another taking advantage of both of those resources. In the meantime, have a blessed and happy fortnight.